Welcome back to the Stronger by Science channel. We are here with esteemed guest slash fellow real doctor, Dr. Eric Helms, PhD doctorate holder, straight from Auckland, New Zealand. We have you here in the lab, in the true science lab, aka the video room, to talk about bulking. Bulking and whether it's dead. Now, I'll preface this by saying, traditionally, bodybuilders and even strength athletes to a certain extent, or at least used to, do phases of bulking, sometimes more aggressive than others. And you'd hear a lot of, bodybuilders, enhanced and not, supporting the idea that you need to gain massive or at least significant amounts of body weight during a period of a few months in order to actually maximize muscle gain and the potential for muscle gain. But when we look at the current literature, and you're somebody who's looked at the literature both from an overview perspective with a classic paper that you are a co-author on called "Is an Energy Surplus Required to Maximize Muscle Building?" or something of that.
Very close.
Very close, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also, you recently published a study in which you were the first author that looked specifically at different surpluses for muscle gain and whether more aggressive surpluses make sense or not. But before we get into that, what is your take on just the concept of bulking and cutting in general for somebody who wants to maximize muscular potential? Does that even hold any ground? Could we just gain muscle by lifting and staying on maintenance calories? What's the deal there?
No, I really like that you brought it up from that perspective, because I think people need to know where this comes from. And bulking and cutting is actually an artifact of competitive bodybuilding, because you don't have an option as a competitive bodybuilder to do anything except bulk and cut, because you are required to get on stage shredded. So that means you are required to diet down to an unsustainable level of body fat, which means you're therefore required to put back on a certain level of body fat just to get back into a position where you're hormonally functioning and relatively normal and able to still live life. So because bodybuilders are seen as the archetypes of muscularity and the people who know how to build muscle and get shredded and produce the best body composition, they're emulated in a lot of ways. And even the bodybuilders themselves will promote their own methods as the best way to approach it, because they're the best way to approach it in the context of the sport of bodybuilding, but not necessarily if your goal was just to maximize hypertrophy over your entire lifting career. Mm-hmm. Because bodybuilders typically lose some degree of muscle mass getting into shredded condition, or at the very least, they're hitting pause on their muscle building potential and creating a less than ideal environment for building muscle when they compete, ironically, when they look their best. So if you wanted to say, hey, are bodybuilders actually the best archetype for building muscle? Technically not, because when they go through contest prep, they're actually doing something directly counterproductive to it. Mm-hmm. So I think it's important to understand that bulking and cutting is an artifact of bodybuilding, competitive bodybuilding. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a benefit of being in a surplus. And just because bodybuilders must be in a surplus, at least after getting shredded and being in a deficit, doesn't mean there's no reason to never go through phases of intentional weight gain that may come with some fat gain. Mm-hmm. But does it need to come with precipitous, rapid weight gain that you will often see, especially in the immediate post-contest period that bodybuilders do, primarily because they're ravenously hungry and they were shredded? Probably not.
Now, before we get into the latest literature on bulking and whether that's actually necessary to absolutely maximize muscle mass in trained individuals, and if yes, how much of a surplus are we talking about? I wanted to briefly touch on the idea. You briefly touched on staying on a continuous surplus, theoretically, if you wanted to maximize muscle gain. Something that we've often heard in the bodybuilding circle and even in our evidence-based echo chamber is the idea of a P ratio associated with different body fat percentages, different body fat levels, with a claim often made that cutting down to a lower body fat percentage may facilitate a more productive bulking season, mass gaining season for a variety of physiological and sometimes psychological reasons. But if we take away the competitive bodybuilder sort of scenario where, having to cut for huge periods of time may interfere with the muscle that you've gained and so on and so forth. Could somebody theoretically stay at a relatively high body fat percentage and keep on gaining muscle mass effectively, or is that something that could hinder the process of muscle building?
I think there's no reason to believe outside of eventual pragmatic and logical constraints on how much body fat someone's, willing to gain if their goal is to become muscular, to think that they couldn't keep building muscle. There is actually a fantastic participant-level, non-published meta-analysis that Dr. Eric Trexler did, looking specifically at the influence of body composition on muscle mass gains that he did in his classic debate with Menno Henselmans. Great example of how to do a debate properly, in my opinion. And if anything, there was a slight tendency towards people higher in body fat to be putting on more muscle, not less. So the data does not support at least one side of P ratios, and that's the idea that when you're higher in body fat, you have a greater predilection to gain more body fat. However, unfortunately, the other side of P ratios does seem to be true, that when you are leaner and leaner and leaner, you're more likely to lose muscle mass. So it's not a good news for those of us who are trying to maximize body composition, but it makes sense from an evolutionary biology perspective, in my opinion. Now, with that said, just because there's no evidence that gaining more body fat is going to lead towards gaining more proportion of body fat and therefore less muscle, I think most people will find practical constraints to what's a reasonable amount of body fat to gain. Like if you come to me and you say, hey, I really want to put on as much muscle mass as possible, I don't have an interest in getting shredded, I just want to be big and muscular. There is typically a point for most people where they start to look less muscular with muscle gain if it comes with fat past a certain point. So most people, and I think this should be their personal preference, will hit some point either aesthetically or maybe what they're comfortable with as far as health or performance or just how they feel, where they won't want to gain more body fat. And I think you will probably benefit from running occasional cutting or bulking cycles, but they don't necessarily need to look like that of a bodybuilder where you're getting really, really lean or you're doing it super periodically, but it might be 3 years of a very small surplus and then a 6-month period of cutting, and you rinse and repeat that, as opposed to, say, 4 months on, 1 month off, bulk cut or something like that.
As far as certain cutoff points or certain variables that you monitor, let's say, to decide whether, okay, we have these sort of non-negotiable cutoff points, at least from a health perspective. I've heard some people quote 40 inches for men, at least, as a waist circumference cutoff point for health, and the literature somewhat supports that number. Are you a proponent of such an approach for people?
I think, yeah. So if we think about how do we measure risk of negative health outcomes related to body composition, I think the most important thing to remember is that body composition is not a marker of health. It is a potential indicator of a higher or lower risk of developing a health complication. So BMI has come under, body mass index, has come under a lot of fire lately because it is not a marker of health, but it is associated with, say, poorer blood markers for health related to cholesterol, blood pressure, et cetera, or a higher risk of developing metabolic disease, heart attack, or just all-cause mortality. And the data does indicate that once you're actually into like class 1, class 2, especially class 3 obesity, that the probability of you having poorer health objectively is a lot higher, but it's still not the same thing, right? So metabolically healthy individuals with obesity do exist. And we shouldn't make assumptions about someone's health status based upon body composition. However, you can be probabilistically sure that at a certain point you are running a higher odds ratio of developing health consequences. So there's a few ways to look at it, and it depends on how comfortable you are with risk. BMI is imperfect, and body fat percentage is slightly better. Waist circumference measurement is probably even better because it's giving you some indication of potential visceral fat, which is probably more associated with metabolic health. But if you wanted to take the most risk-adverse position, you could look at, all right, what body fat percentages are associated with BMI of the overweight classification or higher. And for men, depending upon ethnicity and age, you're typically looking at the mid to low 20% body fat range.
Exactly.
But then the issue is, well, how do I measure my body fat percentage? And so you run into these issues. So all of the potential ways of doing it do have problems. I think probably the best way to do it is just to regularly see your doctor. And if you notice that your blood pressure, your resting heart rate, or your cholesterol, LDL and HDL, are moving in the wrong direction, and it seems to be associated with when you get above a certain weight, then maybe that's a decent cutoff for you if health is your primary indicator.
And just a very small parenthesis, with BMI specifically, looking closer at the data, I had assumed that BMI that classes you as overweight and then obese is associated with so much greater risk. But when you look closely, it's mostly type 3, category 3, that things take a turn for the worse. Obviously, there's a higher risk with being overweight based on BMI, but it wasn't as bad as I had assumed.
No, the overweight category, in some analyses, doesn't carry any more risk than the normal range.
Yeah.
It's typically when you see BMIs that start with a 3, where you start to see pretty clear, at least statistically more probable likelihoods of individuals having metabolic health issues.
Exactly, a 30 and above. That's nice. But closing that parenthesis, so for a good deal of people, the idea of staying at a relatively high body fat percentage and just bulking, till the end of times, I mean, for some of us, that sounds great. But for a lot of people, especially those that consume the content that we make, they have a specific physique in mind. They want to maximize body composition and so on and so forth. And since body fat percentage does not seem to impact muscle growth directly, what does the latest data on different surpluses of different magnitude have to say about that in muscle gain? Does it make sense to gain a bunch of body fat in order to maximize muscle growth, even though it doesn't seem to have a negative effect? Or could you get away with eating just slightly above maintenance and still see the same gains? A worst interviewer here suggesting the responses.
You're doing great. I need a leading question because I don't know the answers to anything. No, I think there's an important distinction in the way you ask that question between gaining body fat and then the size of the surplus.
Yes.
And the reason I make that distinction is because based upon the individual and their, let's say, growth potential, you're going to see different responses to the same size surplus. So one of the very first studies that came out on quote-unquote bulking was done by Rosnick and colleagues in 2002. And this study basically came out and the bros would have been like, I told you we were right. You got to go on the seafood diet. That's SEE. You see the food, you eat it. Go hard, go home. Eat big to get big. Let's go. Dave Tate. Writing on, good old T-Nation. Large pizza, pour olive oil on it, choke it down, you're going to be huge. Right?
Thank you. That's the end of the video. Thank you so much for being here. That confirms my biases. One big pizza with olive oil coming right up.
Domino's Pizza, we're calling you right now. This study specifically took untrained young university-aged males. Okay, they had not done any resistance training previously. 3 different groups, put them all on a resistance training program for 8 weeks. And then 2 of those groups, they gave them essentially a weight gainer. 2,000 calories on top of their habitual diet. That doesn't necessarily mean they're in a 2,000 calorie surplus because, you give them a habitual diet, it'll change in modification based upon how they feel in response to this. One of them, it was protein and maltodextrin, so basically carbs and protein. The other group, pure carbs, just maltodextrin. 2,000 calories of basically sugar. Thanks. And then the final group was just following their habitual diet. What's crazy is they gained 3 kilos of body mass in both surplus groups that got the 2,000 calories of maltodextrin or the 2,000 calories of maltodextrin plus protein and 3 kilograms of lean body mass, meaning that they gained roughly a pound a week for the whole 8-week study of pure lean body mass from throwing down an additional 2,000 calories of straight sugar in one of these groups. That shows you how powerful the initial training stimulus is when you're untrained, and that you can actually shortchange your gains if you're not in a large enough surplus when you're untrained. I think that's a key critical component.
Yeah.
And even more so, it didn't matter that they were consuming it all from sugar, that they didn't even have a protein shake. Macronutrients didn't matter. There's a huge energy demand. You mentioned the paper we wrote on, is a surplus required to maximize muscle mass gains? That paper, we identified all of the energetic demands associated with putting on muscle. For an untrained person, there's the cost of the actual exercise itself. Then there's the actual energy content of muscle, which is not that high because muscle is mostly water, and then the parts of it that actually contain energy, it's protein, so it's only 4 calories per gram, say compared to the 9 calories per gram of adipose tissue that's actually triglyceride. There's also the potential increase in non-exercise physical activity or non-exercise activity thermogenesis that some people have in response to being in a surplus that you have to offset. And there's also something that we struggle to quantify, and that's the actual energy cost of initiating and sustaining muscle protein synthesis. So not the energy cost of the muscle, but the cost of building it. So that is an energy expensive process, and you don't want to shortchange that, or you can shortchange your actual muscle gain. And if we go back to Rosnick and colleagues, the control group gained about half as much lean body mass as the 2 groups that were actually increasing their calories by 2,000. And what's crazy is just how powerful resistance training and stimulus is when you're untrained. They also lost, on average, about 1 kilogram of fat mass.
Oh, wow.
So the stimulus was so high that to get even just half the gains of the other groups, they were losing fat mass. They were experiencing body recomposition. So that tells us 2 really interesting things. One, you can actually build muscle in a deficit. Because if you think about losing 1 kilogram of fat mass and gaining 1.5 kilograms of lean mass, that's actually a net energy deficit when you look at the energy content of those different tissues. So an untrained individual is going to make great gains no matter what, even in a less than ideal nutritional circumstance. But if your goal is maximizing muscle gain, then you want to be in a big surplus. The unfortunate thing, though, is that not only in the subsequent research that was done by Garth and colleagues in 2013, but also the one that you referenced that we did 10 years after that, publishing it last year, we found this is not the case in well-trained individuals. Obviously, your growth potential slows down, and we have this logarithmic curve that is unfavorable. Basically, the more muscle mass you put on, it's kind of like a P ratio. The less muscle mass you can put on, and the slower it occurs. So if you try to force feed this process, you don't actually accelerate the process, you just gain more fat mass. This is observed by Garth and colleagues in not super well resistance trained athletes, but elite level athletes from multiple different sports codes who had strength conditioning experience. They tried to gain weight faster or slower, and the faster weight gain that was observed resulted in additional fat mass gains with no significant difference between groups in lean mass gained or changes in strength. And then recently, we observed something similar targeting specifically well-trained resistance-trained athletes back last year. We tried to see if we could milk more out of individuals with different sizes of surpluses, and I'm sure you'll have more questions about it. But our principal findings were that the more weight you gained, the more likely you were to put on skin fold thicknesses or subcutaneous body fat without necessarily an impact on tricep muscle thickness, quadricep muscle thickness, or 1RM squat or bench press gains, although there was a lot of caveats and specifics to take out of that study, if you will.
Yeah, there was also, if I remember correctly, the group that was on a larger surplus. So one of the groups was supposed to be on a slightly less aggressive surplus, but they ended up on an aggressive surplus, right?
So this was a study we did during COVID. So we had about half of the N that we intended to have. So a post hoc decision that we made for analysis to get a reasonable interpretation of our findings was we wanted to look at the group as a whole. Because when you do human research, even when you have a dietitian like we did, interacting with these people on a regular basis, answering questions, adjusting the surplus based upon weight change, humans are going to human. And there's going to be some degree of variability in how well they adhere to the protocol and also how their body responds. You know, like I said, there's some people are going to ramp up neat, some are not. Some people are going to gain more or less weight than you'd expect based upon the prescribed surplus. So our study was set up to have a group that continued to eat at maintenance after a familiarization and weight maintenance stabilization phase, and then 2 other groups that went to either a 5% surplus or a 15% surplus over what they did, doing the same training 3 days per week, and then measuring their progress over 8 weeks. And these are all people who had at least 1 year of resistance training experience and had at least a certain strength standard in the bench press and squat 1RM. And we had a fair number of competitive powerlifters, weightlifters, and even some physique athletes. So it's a pretty well-trained sample. Now, just because we assign them 15% or 5% surplus doesn't mean that their weight gain necessarily reflected that. And we ended up with only having about 5 or 6 people in each group. And we didn't want to do a comparison between groups with only 5 or 6.
Yep.
Even though, in our pre-registration documents, you can see that's what we plan to do. So instead, what we did was we analyzed continuously, so looking at the whole group, changes in body mass and the relationship between changes in body mass and changes in other outcomes of interest, such as strength and muscle mass and fat mass changes. The cool thing about this is now, instead of comparing groups of 5 or 6, we're looking at a continuous relationship in 17 people. And that was sufficiently powered by our best estimation to make some reasonable inferences. And essentially, because, like you said, some of the people in the small surplus group gained more weight than anticipated, and some of the people in the large surplus group gained less, when you look at those group mean changes in body weight, they were the same, or at least the means were very similar. But when you simply use a regression to analyze all 17 individuals, now we can see the whole plot of gaining no body weight or a lot of body weight or a little bit of body weight and the relationship with changes in skin folds and also muscle thickness and 1RM strength. And now we can start to go, oh, okay, now we can see what is more likely to happen when you gain more or less body weight as far as how that changes body composition and performance.
I remember seeing that the bicep
Yes.
measurements were favored those who gain more body fat, but
Body weight.
Body weight, yeah. At the same time, I remember also seeing that muscle group had more volume allocated to it. Anything interesting there?
Yes, I think so our main findings, just to get right to it, was that the strongest evidence we found, we used a Bayesian analysis, and essentially we reported Bayes factors, which are more or less an odds ratio. An easy way to understand this is that we had a 14.3 BF10, which just means that if you were to take any 2 participants out of the hat, we got 17 individuals that are in a hat. We had very small participants in a very large hat, by the way.
I was about to reach in the hat. Nice.
Yeah, take 2 out.
You got to me first with a joke.
Perfect. So we got our 2 individuals, right? And if one of them gained more weight than the other, if we went to Vegas, you'd be smart to bet that they also gained more body fat, because that 14.3 means that there's 14.3 times greater likelihood that the person who gained more weight also gained more body fat, which we measured as a sum of 8 skin folds. Okay? Pretty strong evidence, right? So, bicep thickness is the one variable besides body fat that also seemed to have some evidence that was related to gaining more body mass as well. So there was no meaningful relationship between 1RM squat, bench, tricep, or quadricep muscle thickness, but there was for biceps. Much weaker evidence though. So this is kind of like this little bit of saving grace that we think for bulking, but then when I explain to you how strong the evidence is, you're like, ah. So we had 14.3 as our Bayes factor for body fat, 1.4 for biceps.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, there's a 1.4 times greater likelihood if we took those same individuals that this guy's arms or this gal's arms, we had a mixed sex group, gained more thickness, but it's 1/10 the strength of evidence of body fat. And the question is, well, why was there any evidence that the biceps responded differently? And it has nothing to do with the nutrition. You don't have extra calorie receptors in your biceps. Or do you?
Or do you? What are they hiding? Snipers.
Probably what it was the disparity in the volumes and the proximities to failures that the different muscle groups are trained with.
Yeah.
So if we look at the current evidence we have that informs group-based averages for volume and intensity, we've got the Robinson meta-regression that indicates generally closer to failure is generally better. And we have both the Basval and the Schoenfeld meta-analyses that would collectively say, hey, maybe between 12 to 20, 10 to 20 sets per muscle group is where most people will start to see a tapering of their hypertrophy response, right? So if you look at the training protocol in our study, we had 9 sets of direct submaximal not to failure work for the quads. We had 15 sets for the triceps, which was a mixture of direct and indirect work and a mixture of maximal and submaximal. Sorry, it was all indirect work. It was all bench press and shoulder press for the triceps. And half of it, or I should say a third of it, was to failure, and the rest was probably submaximal. And actually in Basval, they specifically found that triceps seemed to respond to higher volumes, likely an artifact of direct versus indirect work. And then only the biceps did we actually meet some of the criteria that would indicate this should be optimizing hypertrophy. They had 18 sets, half indirect, half direct, and all of the direct work for the biceps was to failure. They did a bicep curl every day, and they either did a row or a pull down on the 3 days of training. So when we think about this being a group-based study and us looking at group-based averages from meta-analyses, it makes sense that the biceps probably would have responded best on average. So this really confirms something that I've thought for a long time. So confirmation bias, it's a great thing, is that your nutrition is permissive to growth. And an analogy I like to use is that if your nutrition is the soil, if it's the sun, if it's the water, the seed is training. And you can, have a really nice field and plant it, get the best soil, great environment, create the perfect environment to grow something. But if you don't have a seed, nothing will grow. So ultimately, what people need to understand is that you can't force feed your gains. And these data suggest that if you have a really, really good program, you can probably benefit from having a larger surplus because there's a more growth potential. But if the growth potential isn't there, then those calories have to go somewhere, and you can't force feed muscle to grow. It's probably going to come in the form of body fat.
So where does this all leave us in terms of practical applications? So for the majority of individuals who want to maximize body composition and want to get jacked, but at the same time don't necessarily care to carry the additional body fat for aesthetic reasons, health reasons, whatever, what is like a blanket recommendation that you'd give them in terms of surplus percentage and potentially training modifications based on surplus magnitude?
Absolutely. So I think the first thing to consider is that if you don't have a training program that is well set up to maximize the potential for building muscle, putting yourself into a surplus is not going to go well. Then the second thing to consider is what's your growth potential? And if you've only been in the gym for 6 weeks, it's going to be a lot higher than if you've been in the gym for 6 years.
Yeah.
So while I don't have specific guidelines on how quickly someone can gain muscle, because it's going to vary tremendously between individuals, we do have the theoretical backing to say that you probably want to scale your surplus size inversely to your training experience. Meaning that like Rosnick saw in those untrained individuals, this is the time when you actually can bulk. If you are an untrained participant in a study, just like we saw in Rosnick, just like if you're the first time stepping into the gym in the real world, you'll probably benefit from being in a large surplus. And I think you could reasonably put yourself in a 10 or even 20% calorie surplus, and you would benefit from that. So if you're eating 3,000 calories a day to maintain body weight, and you know what, I want to go on this new program, you've got even half decent genetics and you're training hard, you could probably eat 3,500, 3,600 calories, and you might see the majority of that actually be muscle gain for a while. However, once you're an intermediate level lifter, once you're an advanced level lifter, I think you want to start cutting that down pretty substantially, and now we're talking about a 5 to 10% calorie surplus. And as far as the rate of body weight gains, that's another way to kind of back calculate that. I think you probably don't want to be gaining any more than, say, 2% of your body weight per month when you're a novice, and probably no more than half that, say 1% of your body weight per month once you are more experienced. So basically what you want to do is set up an ideal training program as best as you can, informed by the evidence, and then scale your surplus to your training experience. Those are the big rocks. Of course, from there, then you need to look at individual response. If you are gaining too slow, you're hungry, and everything you seem to be putting on is muscle, try to eat a little more, right? Likewise, on the other end of the spectrum, if you think you're doing everything right, but you just notice yourself gaining body fat and it's relatively quick and you're not seeing performance improvements, maybe scale back and or reevaluate your training approach.
And because I know this will come up, what about main gaining? The idea of staying on maintenance calories for long periods of time, especially as an advanced training, and just riding that out and essentially experiencing body recomposition. Is that something that you'd recommend for people that want to get pretty jacked?
Well, first off, it's gaintaining.
Gaintaining.
It's not main gaining. This is an abomination of the term that was brought up way after the fact. We've had gaintaining forever.
I was a gaintaining guy. I think Jeff Nippert brought up main gaining.
No, it was someone else whose name will not be spoken. And we're going to bring back gaintaining. That's all I have to say.
Bringing it back.
So gaintaining is what we're talking about here. And essentially what we were able to identify in our review from 2019. So in that prior mentioned review by Slater and colleagues on is an energy surplus required, we couldn't state that an energy surplus was required to maximize muscle mass. All we knew for sure was that you needed to satisfy all the energetic demands of building muscle, which technically could be maintenance. And there was actually a 2021 meta-regression that was done by Murphy that found, yeah, you can absolutely build muscle in a deficit. And on average, with a fair amount of variability, you're able to build that muscle until you're in, like, say, a 500 calorie deficit.
Yep.
And at that point, on average, do people start to see no hypertrophy.
Yep.
So this kind of supports what we initially thought from that review. In practical terms, it's difficult to know exactly where maintenance is, but it's certainly true that if you are close to maintenance, you should be able to make gains, especially if you have a strong stimulus and a high growth potential. As we saw in Rosnick, those folks were actually in a deficit on average based upon the change in fat mass relative to the change in muscle mass, but they still grew muscle, even though it wasn't as much as the groups that got the 2,000 calorie weight gainer on top of it. So I think absolutely gaintaining is a reasonable approach, and I think there's nothing wrong with it. And if you highly value trying to maintain a certain level of body fat that's within a reasonable range, that's certainly fine. And if you are okay with potentially shortcutting your gains a little bit, more power to you. I think probably a better approach that might be more efficient is just trying to make sure that you're in a very small surplus, which could also be classified as gaintaining, and just seeing the scale go up really slowly, like 0.5% or 1% per month. Then you know at least you're not spending long periods of time in a deficit, which you do want to avoid. And you can always adjust. But essentially what you want to be seeing is slow weight gain over time. It does not need to be fast, and there's no reason for us to think that gaining faster is going to help you in any way in terms of strength or hypertrophy.
So I ask you again, is bulking dead?
I would say that bulking is alive and well for those new to lifting. But going back to bulking, I think you can call it bulking, but in reality, it's probably something a little more like lean gaining.
So the old idea, in the classic pictures of Lee Priest and Jay Cutler, there's one of Ronnie Coleman as well, where they look, morbidly obese. The idea that you need to get to that stage in order to actually look amazing or on stage or after you do your cut or whatever, that doesn't hold much value, much truth, at least for non-enhanced, natural individuals who look to maximize muscle gain.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand one more historical thing is that when bulking got popularized, it was an era where many of the thought leaders were from the enhanced ranks of both bodybuilding and powerlifting, and it consisted largely of enhanced super heavyweight powerlifters.
Yes.
And it also consisted largely of IFBB pros.
Yes.
So, of course, in those cases where your growth potential has variable limits, depending upon what you're doing at the time, you can make a case for going through true bulking phases. But if that's not you, if you're not running copious amounts of anabolic steroids, or if you are not a super heavyweight who actually doesn't care how much body fat you put on, and hey, you know what? This is the multiply era of the mid-2000s. That extra body fat might actually just stretch my multiply bench press shirt or squat suit a little bit and give me some more poundages. Body fat's okay. If that's not you, maybe that shouldn't be the most appropriate advice.
But it's probably you. So good luck on your bulk. Eric Helms, ladies and gentlemen, another handshake. My hands are sweaty. Don't forget to like, subscribe. Eric's socials are in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'm not sure where to look. Too many cameras. I will look directly into your eyes, and therefore the soul of the audience. And see you guys next time. Peace.